It's so nice. It's so nice to live in Birmingham where I can get to the airport 5 minutes from my house. What like Washington?
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to the Beit Midrash. Thank you again to Barbara for fearlessly leading us last week. I just wanted to check in before we start. Was there any residual questions from last week? Anything that came up that you're like, we don't know, so we should ask the rabbi? Because I'm back, so you can ask me.
You know, I think there was, but I can't remember what it was.
I agree with Laura. I would just check my notes from last week to see, did I at least write down what the question or what the issue was? Because I know I said, not me, that's an ask the rabbi question.
Yeah.
So I absolutely agree with Laura. It happened, but.
Okay, well, if you think of it, you can ask me later.
Or if whoever asked thought of it and thinks of it.
Or you can send me an email or whatever it is. But welcome. We're now 40% through the Torah, more or less, at least by books. We've gone through Bereshit and Shemot, Genesis and Exodus, and entering Vayikra, Leviticus, and the new book of the Torah. What he ominously calls the call. I kind of felt like that could be like the title of a horror movie or something. Everybody fears the call. But clearly not what Rabbi Sacks had in mind. But nonetheless, any thoughts, comments, reactions from Rabbi Sacks' commentary?
I'm counting to 30 to let everybody in before I start complaining.
26, 27, 28.
I was going to say, I taught my previous congregation, I had a class, and, same person would always start off reading in the class. Like I'd have everybody read us like a paragraph, and it was always the same person. To the point that when he wasn't there for some reason, I all right, who wants to start? And they'd all look around because they'd have no idea who to start because David wasn't there. So I think it's, if you don't start, Barbara, nobody else can start because they know you got to start it off.
No. I start every couple of weeks. When you're there, I'm on vacation. Except it bugs me about this. That maybe it was when I was a little kid thinking about sin, because as a little kid, I never had any sins in this way. And this parsha concentrates so much on sin that, again, we're like on page 4 before he explains what connection there is. From talking about sin, which he doesn't bother to do much, to talking about what do you do in case you sin or when you sin. The answer is sacrifice A, B, C, or D. Take your pick for whichever one applies to the sacrifice you're talking about. And then he finally explains, he's on the last page. He's on the the bottom of the third paragraph from the bottom, page 131, where he says, the book is about sacrifice and vocation, which he's been talking about all along, requires sacrifice. And sometimes I've really felt that Rabbi Sacks is hanging by a thin thread. Not that I disagree with his ideas, but it's a very thin connection to what was important to me. And I say was important, maybe I'm being convinced in a different direction. What was important about this particular parsha. So if no one else seems to have been struck by the lack of talking about this type of sin and that type of sin, and where this one applies and where that one applies, and which one's intentional and which one isn't intentional, and which one applies, or which sin occurs because your mind and your body are involved. When I plan to rob the bank, that's mind and body. If I just do something in my mind, if I think about that cheeseburger, but I never eat it, I guess that's just in my mind. But anyway, there's so much detail that he could have gotten into, and so much interesting stuff when you're a little kid, or even a 45-year-old trying to get this all straight. Or maybe a 43-year-old rabbi getting this all straight. I wish there had been more discussion of that.
So here's what I'll say is, you know, when you write a Devar Torah, you don't write a Devar Torah on the entire parsha.
Right, you don't need to retell the story.
You don't, you know, you're not going to hit it. You know, I often tell the story. Before I went to rabbinical school, but when I was like, everybody knew I was looking to go. My rabbi at the time gave a 45-minute sermon on a regular Shabbat morning, not like a holiday, not like a high holiday, nothing special. He gave a 45-minute sermon. I couldn't tell you what the sermon was about. I have no recollection whatsoever. But I do remember distinctly that he finished, and I'm like, I desperately need the bathroom. So I got up, went to the bathroom, was coming back, and one of the ushers was standing outside and looked at me and goes, Steve, do me a favor. Like, sure. What can I? He's like, you become a rabbi. Sermons, no more than 10 minutes. Ever. High holidays, maybe you can go a little longer, but no more than 10 minutes. I sometimes go like 12, but I try to keep my promise to him, because, you know, it's a long service. You don't need to hear me rambling for too long. But, you know, in a 12-minute sermon, let's say a 10-minute sermon, you're not going to cover all the details and lessons that you can learn in a particular parsha. It just can't. So what do? You focus on a verse, you focus on a phrase, you focus, in this case, he's focusing on a word in the book. I think I have given a sermon on this parsha on a letter in the parsha. Like, you're not going to cover everything. So, you know, I just looked. Rabbi Sacks has like a whole series called Covenant and Conversation, in which he has like multiple Divrei Torah on each parsha, and on Vayikra he does have a Devar Torah on sin. Right. It's just not in this book. So, you know, you're never going to cover everything in a sermon. He's not covering everything in this sermon. He's covering Vayikra and what does it mean to be called.
Do you mind if I ask a question?
Yes, please. That was just my, you know, I just want to make that clear. Like, you're never going to get everything in a parsha in one of his Divrei Torah, because that's not what he's trying to do. He's trying to take one little piece of that Torah and see what is an idea that can change the world from this one little section.
Well, I know we're going to talk about vocation. I want to talk about vocation, but like Barbara, in reading the Torah on for this parsha, you know, the thought came to my mind. I was like, most of this stuff is not happening today. I mean, we're not making any sacrifices. And so my question, and the answer, I have another question that answers this, but so does God know? Do we think that God knows what the future is? God knows what's going to happen, you know, next year, next century, next millennium, or whatever.
Is that I thought you said you had a question.
No, I have a question on, because if God, I guess my concept was that God does know what's happening in the future. And if God knows what's happening in the future, why did he spend so much time in the Torah talking about things that are not relevant, I mean, in a certain sense, to what we are doing today.
Okay. So I'll answer the second question first. That God does know everything that's going to happen in the future. Why does God spend so much time? If you want like a right-wing Orthodox view, it's because eventually in the Messianic age, we're going to have a third temple and we're going to resume doing all this again. So it needs to be there. If you want a less traditional response, it's that there's still great learning and great lessons we can learn if we just don't read it as like a literal instruction manual. So the idea that, just to take one concept, that the idea that sacrificing an animal is a way to connect with God. Well, okay, maybe we don't sacrifice an animal, but relationships inherently involve some sort of self-sacrifice and withdrawal, what we call tzimtzum, like contraction of the self, to be able to build a space to have that relationship. And that what Vayikra is doing is giving us this concept as a whole of how can we, you have to give something up in order to be able to have a relationship. And it's not just, you do it at any time. There's a Tamid sacrifice that's done every day. There's a Shlamim sacrifice that is done for certain occasions. There's an Olah sacrifice that's done on other occasions. There's a Todah sacrifice that's done in another. So like, it's not just done, there's different circumstances require different levels of relationship. And so maybe Vayikra is giving us that outline. I'm kind of riffing here. Going back to your first question, I'm going to take the process theology view that God does not know what's going to happen in the future. And so God is growing and developing and in process with us along the way and adapting along with the choices that we make.
Jumping into the middle of something that I have no idea what you're talking about, but and it would seem to me that, as we've talked about before about having free will, then if we have free will, it would seem like God could not know what by so to speak giving us free will, or that is another kind of tzimtzum.
Yeah, there is something philosophically challenging of having an omniscient God who knows everything and giving us free will, because that means either God knows the choices we're going to make, or is giving us false choices, because we don't actually have free will because God already knows what the choice is going to be. So therefore, we're not actually making a choice because the choice has already been made in some sense. Rabbis have a difficult time with this controversy. I see Laura like rubbing her eyes as I'm doing. I'm like, oh, my head hurts thinking about it. So, the rabbis struggle with this philosophical conundrum also of, can God know what's going on and can we have free will simultaneously? And they wrestle with it. And as is the Jewish way, some rabbis feel one way, some rabbis feel a different way.
That's good to know.
That's just like how I felt. I just read the book, and it was like finding what God has meant for you. You might go through a lot of false paths, and
God knows I did.
huh?
God knows I did.
And then if you don't find it, it's okay. Your life is still purposeful and good. It's kind of a little hypocritical, I felt. So
What do you mean? Why do you say hypocritical?
Well, it's like, okay, to say God has a plan for you. He has a vocation just for you. You just have to find it. Um, so, but if you don't find it, that's perfectly fine. It's kind of like, well, you're sure. Um, I'm sorry, my words just don't come to me these days very fast. It's kind of a sure bet.
Well, really, he hedges it because even in his conclusion, he says God may have a task for you. I mean, he's off the hook for this whole business, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, but it's like, how can you? And I'm not saying that I believe this way, but if you were of the notion that God has a plan for you, then it would be pretty bad not to ever find that plan. But by saying, but it's perfectly fine if you don't ever find that plan, it's a little, I don't know. I
I
don't know
hear
why.
what you're saying. So let me
That-
try it from a different angle and see if it helps. Do you guys know the joke about the first Jewish president?
Yeah.
No, this is an old joke about the first Jewish president. So
President of what?
The day comes, elections happen, and lo and behold, America elects the first Jewish president of the United States. And he's ecstatic, he's thrilled, and they start the plans for the inauguration, and he calls his mom and goes, "Mom, can you believe it?" And she's like, "Yeah, good for you." So they start the plan for the inauguration. He goes, "Mom, I really want you to come for my inauguration." She's like, eh. He goes, "No, Mom, you have to be there." And she's like, "It's fine. You don't need me there. There's going to be lots of people. You don't need to. I don't need to come." And this goes on for a while. And he's like, "Mom, it would mean so much to me if you'd come." She's like, "Fine, I'll be there."
She says what?
She's like, "Fine, I'll be there."
Oh, okay.
Like So inauguration day comes. The president is standing there with a kippah on, with his hand on a Tanakh, taking the vows, and his mom leans over to next to him and goes, he could have been a doctor. So think of it that way, right? The mother had a plan for her son. He could have been a doctor. Would he had a bad life as a doctor? Probably not. Doctors can have a good life. But that wasn't his plan. He picked a different plan. And he has a good life as, God willing, he has a good life as the new president of the United States. So, God, I think, does God have a plan? Possibly. But I do think there is within us some sense of where our soul wants us to go, what our soul wants us to do. And some of us don't want to listen to that for any variety of reasons. Maybe it's peer pressure, maybe it's parental pressure, maybe it's spousal pressure, maybe it's the fact that you're not going to make a good living doing it. Maybe it's just a very hard job to get into and you don't want to go through it. There's lots of different reasons we might choose not to do what our soul calls us to do. Does that mean our life is worthless? Our life is not good, that we can't have a good life? No, it just means that we're not necessarily doing what our soul kind of pulls on us to do. And I think that pull is what he's talking about for vocation. We each have something that God, with our divine soul, kind of pulls us towards something. Some of us tune it out. Some of us don't. Do we have a worse life or an unholy life because of it? No, but does that kind of help the concept a little bit?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Still ultimately, again, this is kind of a process theology perspective, but we ultimately, God might have a plan, but we still have the choice of whether we're going to follow that.
Mm.
Which he doesn't quite go that far to say, but
I mean, I particularly liked what Michael Novak said about 4 characteristics of a vocation, and that might help all of us think about it for ourselves. First, I'll just read it. First, it is unique to you. Second, you have the talent for it. Third, it is something which, when you do it, gives you a sense of enjoyment and renewed energy. And fourth, do not expect it to reveal itself immediately. You may have to follow many paths that turn out to be false before you find the true one. And that at least gives you a structure to think about it, I think. But when they were saying, giving examples of people, for instance, a doctor who is a concert pianist quality talent, he could have chosen either of those pathways, I think, and both of them were great pathways. So how does that person know what God's plan is for him? Because he could be great in either of those.
I have a cousin who is a wonderful pianist and could have been the concert pianist. And his mom wanted him to be the concert pianist. She was fine with that. But he was influenced by his wife. He's a doctor. He's a great oncologist. And
we need great oncologists and we need great concert pianists.
Yeah. But there's one thing that Sacks says. He says, this is true. There's a task for you to do. God calls you to that task. But you have to believe that God has that ability to call you. Otherwise, you won't be listening to that voice. He doesn't say otherwise you won't be listening to that voice. But on the bottom of 129 and the top of 130, he goes through the fact that that's true for all of the idea of a vocation, that's your vocation, is there for all who believe in divine providence. And if you think individually about when did you start deciding that you were going to be a this or a that, and what were the reasons running in your head at the time? Mine goes to what we said when we first got on today. Stuart said it's a beautiful day. And that's why I became a geologist. There was no other major that I could have where you were out exploring new areas, seeing new things, going new places. We've been all around the world doing geology, and there's not much better than that. And maybe God didn't put it in my ear, but he put it in my eyes and my head that being out there with that was a great thing to do. But I never thought of it that way. I just thought, hey, I really like these field trips. I really like being out here. I really like that.
So, I hear what you're saying, but I'm going to debate somewhat in that there are lots of jobs that take you to lots of different places. You could have gone into international business and traveled to all sorts of new places and visited things. Instead of studying rocks, you could have studied trees. You could have studied birds and traveled to all these different places and seen all these different things. There's something about geology that you were drawn to.
I was getting A's in geology and B's in biology. We're up to the second week or second test of the semester. But
so
I agree with you. You're right, Rabbi. There are many ways if your motivation was to get out and see the world. from
Right.
small country town in New Jersey that I grew up in.
But there was something about that, about studying rocks and being outdoors, that really, that you felt drawn to. And I guess part of my argument is, in some sense, it's not like my daughter and I were talking about. It's not like Monty Python and the Holy Grail, where the skies open and God talks to you and says, Barbara, you need to become a geologist.
I knew you were going to say it that way, Rabbi. I had it for you to say, God doesn't always use words. Maybe
Right.
the drama of him coming down from the sky would have told me, yeah, go be that doctor, go be that lawyer.
Yeah. So, it is some great scenes of, in Monty Python, though, of, the skies opening and the angelic choirs. But anyway, I digress. Right. But there's something, if the soul, if that's, divine part of us is pulling us in that direction, that's God telling us where we're supposed to go, what we're supposed to do. And yes, we can tune it out, we can ignore it, but that's the vocation, that's the call that he's talking about. Is that, I really want to go in this direction. Do I actually do it?
Well, and we've emphasized, especially even last week, how important it is to make space for God to come into your life. And so the more space and the closer God comes to you, that you allow God to come to you, though I think the more likely that you will be able to hear what God is trying to tell you. So what we're doing today, I mean, these Beit Midrash, I think, are helping us in that process.
Maybe they should have happened 50 years ago. But one thing that I did not like about this chapter was that all of the people, himself, of course, and all of the people he talked about were these just fabulously multi-talented, people who could have been anything in the world. And, and then they're, I'm kind of like more of like a Joe Schmo, I could wire lamps or do this or that or the other thing. And I don't, for someone who is not, who may not have that kind of degree of talent or that many choices or whatnot, somehow this idea of God calling seems, at least not necessarily the idea, but the way in which, because there's certainly people of very modest backgrounds who have done very important things, but the way in which Sacks frames it is a little bit kind of off-putting.
So look, why are these people such great people? Rabbi Sacks was just a Joe Schmo until he became Rabbi Sacks. Viktor Frankl was a Holocaust survivor, but I mean, it's what he did after that really made him Viktor Frankl. I think that's part of the point, is like, these are just, yes, they might be talented, but they're ordinary people who are using their talents and putting them towards something that their soul is, that only they can do, that they have a talent for, that they enjoy doing, and they don't always figure it out right away. And I think that's a little bit of his point, is that it doesn't have to be somebody a concert pianist or a Viktor Frankl or a Jonathan Sacks. It's true for all of us because they're all just regular people who happen to go into whatever they're doing.
And then became very good at what they were doing.
Yes. Yes. They became good at it because it was part of what, because they were enjoying it and their soul was calling them to it. They wanted to keep pursuing it. They wanted to keep going. But also, if I hated being a rabbi, then would I be teaching so many classes, right? Like, if I'm hating it, then I'm not going to be as motivated to keep doing it. But they're good at it because they have a talent for it. They're bringing a perspective only they can bring, and they're motivated because it's something that they enjoy doing and they're feeling called to do.
And I think another point that's made is that frequently people don't go on this track of whatever is going to be their life's purpose until there's some external factor that motivates them to do things like the Holocaust for Viktor Frankl. But I mean, I think it's pretty rare for somebody to blossom into some unbelievably successful and well-known person in a certain field just because they looked inside themselves and said, I need to do this. A lot of times it's who they're surrounded by, circumstances that happen, and then they follow their dream that has motivated them in that direction.
Sometimes, sometimes they're getting motivated by exterior people. They have a phenomenal teacher who helps guide them on the right path, or who took them taught them something that they didn't, I didn't think I was going to be interested in chemistry, but I had this phenomenal chemistry teacher who influenced me and taught me to love chemistry. And now I'm like this world-renowned chemist. I forgot his name. I mentioned him in a sermon, but he won the Nobel Prize in like 1944, I think. And he said, like, his mom is like, how did you become this great, scientist? He says, because my mom, when I came home from school, all my friends' moms would say, what did you learn in school today? My mom said, did you ask any good questions today? Like she taught him to ask good questions, and that those good questions caused him to ask other good questions, because that's what was motivating him. And that, was he naturally a good question asker? Maybe, but his mom kind of instilled in him to ask good questions. But going back to Margit's point for a moment, I quote this periodically, Reb Simcha Bunim of Peshischa, early Hasidic Rebbe, who, according to the legend, used to walk around with two pieces of paper in his pocket. You guys know this one? On one paper it says, I am but dust and ashes. And on the other it says, for my sake the world was created. And I think that's true for all of us. It's not because he's Reb Simcha Bunim that the world was created for him. It's because he was Simcha Bunim. And and the world was created because he was him, not because he was special. Barbara, you had your hand up.
I don't know if it's a British English versus American English issue, but his use of the word vocation for this kind of brought me to where Margaret is, that when he's talking about people or he's talking about himself, I think our U.S. interpretation of the word vocation applies to different fields. When you're talking about a vocation, you're talking about something that's pretty much manual, practical, non-academic. But I'm willing to, people who go to vocational schools are different than the ones that turn out to be. But I'm willing to bet that if he had spoken to umpteen of those people, he would have found a similar percentage who felt that they were in the right job. Where's that list of what you have? That they were in their unique position. They had a talent for what they were doing. They got their sense of enjoyment, and from the not Novak, but the next one for Pearsall Smith, who said the test of a vocation is that you go along with the drudgery it involves. So Sacks is just limited in the people he's talking to. That's my hope, Margaret. That's my hope, that if he had expanded his circle, he would have found similar things.
I'm not sure I'm catching the last point.
That he would have found similar things. He would have found people who were in a position, who had the right task that God had given them, and that gave but they got it. Their vocation actually came from what we in America consider vocation. That's why I said I bet it may be a language issue.
It might be a language issue, but
where you are applies to a lot of people, and their life has meaning, their life has purpose. They're not Rabbi Sacks. They're not, some of these concert pianist PhDs or whatever his
one of the most powerful lessons I had in rabbinical schools, I was at there was a seminary, like a Jewish seminary conference. So there was, I think, 5 or 6 seminaries, like rabbinical students from different seminaries that got together for the weekend. And Rabbi Lawrence Kushner was there, and in front of the group said, basically said, the minute that you think that what you're doing is holy work is the minute you should quit being a rabbi. And of course, a lot of the rabbinical students very quickly got up in arms. And they're like, what are you talking about? We're studying Torah. How, of course, what we're doing is holy. We're doing God's work. We're studying Torah and we're doing mitzvot. And he's like, yeah. That's all good. That's all nice and stuff. He's like, but the minute you think that what you're doing is holier than anybody else's work, you need to stop. There's nothing, you are not any holier than the electrician, the plumber, the garbage man, the construction worker, the mechanic, anybody else that are in what you're kind of calling like vocations, right? Like you would go to like vocational school for. You are just as holy as that. You are equally holy in God's eyes. The work you're doing is important, but so is the work that they're doing. And, I'm not much of an electrician, so, I'm very grateful that the electrician has found his vocation. And, can theoretically anybody, hop on a garbage truck and, empty garbage bins? Yeah, anybody could theoretically do it. First of all, not everybody will. But second of all, you don't know that person's, what he's calling vocation, his God-given call, isn't somewhere else. You don't know that he's not counseling people at his church or her church, or doing, helping the homeless and volunteering on the side. And that's where the passion really is, but this is paying the bills. Your call doesn't actually, this is a good point in that, we've been talking about the vocation and God's call as being like your job and your profession that you do. It doesn't really even have to be that. You can get a job, going to the example you gave. You can be a great oncologist and go be a concert pianist as your vocation. I don't know how you'd have enough time to do that, but theoretically you could. You can find your vocation elsewhere in volunteering and contributing in other ways as the pull that God is calling you to do, and that, you might do something else to pay the bills. stunned you guys into silence. Suzanne, did you have something before?
I was just going to say that I've always used the word vocation as your job, and avocation is the hobby, the playing the music. Vocation is what you get paid for. A doctor's vocation is being a doctor, not necessarily in the sense of, I know vocational training in school is more hands-on, but I think if we look it up, and it's probably, I mean, I think all the definitions are correct. I don't know in which order is preferential.
Yeah. And I'm not fluent in British English to know if like vocation might have a different connotation.
About British, I just mean.
I hear you.
So I've read too many British novels. And a vocation is often used, especially in with respect to the clergy, as meaning a calling, a calling off, and perhaps in the sense of calling by God.
I also could say something away from the idea of vocation, if people will accept that. Back to the idea of, wish he'd said more than 3 things about sacrifice, connections with sacrifice. But in one of his other works, he talked about the sacrifices that we make being our modern day version of the sacrifices that were done in the temple. And that the kinds of things that he listed as sacrifice, I thought were, no, that's just what you're supposed to do. Give tzedakah, be kind to others, and the list could go on. But I think that if it's true that there are more people than me who think that those behaviors are part, or should be part of everyday life, then God's gotten his way. It's not the whole world, but for a number of us who naturally give tzedakah, who naturally are kind. Notice I said us. A lot of people, he's gotten his way. He's gotten a bunch of people to be that, to do that. And I think that that's something that I've kind of just come to in this conversation, that if charity, kindness, good living, good life are our substitute for sacrifices today, instead of those old sin offerings. And I really would like the recipe for the mincha offering of the oil and salt and flour and frankincense. I mean, not to go back to the excellent class we had last week talking about building a space for God, when Margaret brought up the fact that people had actually reconstructed Mishkan and everything. We talked about that a bit, but we're talking about taking something and redoing it. Well, Margaret, find me somebody that's made that flour, oil, salt, frankincense bit. Bring it to class and we'll try it. But I'm serious by saying that if charity and kindness are as much of many people's lives as I hope and think they are, got his way. No more sacrifice.
Maybe.
We have this.
I see where he's coming from. It's sacrifice, because what are you doing? You're giving something that you own and giving it to God in that sense. There have been studies done. I've seen them quoted a number of times where those who are affiliated with some kind of faith group give tzedakah essentially at higher rates than those who are not. So there's something about, this idea that you are sacrificing, in the sense, your money as a way to as a form of connection with God that is powerful for people to have them keep continuing. Sorry, the windows just rearranged, so now I had to find where everybody was. I don't know how the frankincense. I don't think the rabbis gave an exact recipe for the frankincense cakes. I believe they, if I remember, there were families who were like proficient in this. There's a whole story in the Talmud of how there are families that were responsible for like the showbread that is supposed to be given. I think it's rotated out every week. There's like loaves of bread that are supposed to be in the temple that are rotated out every week. And there's a family that was responsible for baking them. And at one point they were charging too much. So they tried to get somebody else to do it. And it wasn't good. And it was getting moldy quickly and didn't taste as good and this. So they had to go back to the family and, have them go back to it. Recipes. Interesting story.
Was their vocation.
Exactly. that was their vocation. It was what they gave of themselves that only they were able to do.
Well, do you have any thoughts about your vocation or your calling changing throughout your life? I mean, as you evolve as a person, I mean, especially if you take, many of us are retired now, how you maintain purpose in life, your calling, when your life has changed so much.
Excellent question. I'd say it's not all that different. Going back to what you quoted before from Michael Novak, what is something that is somewhat unique to you that you can do that others can't? What is something that you have a talent for that others don't? What is something that you continue to enjoy doing? So, what is something you want to, that makes you feel fulfilled and energetic, that you feel like this is something I wanted to continue doing, even if it's not my job? How can you continue to contribute and give back using that? And as Rabbi Sacks kind of says, might take a couple tries to find the right thing, right? You might not find it right away. It might take some time for you to try some different things out and be like, yeah, that was nice, but not doing that again. It might take some trial and error to find the thing that, really speaks to you.
Well, you also don't want to feel guilt as you like go into retirement. And of course, now you want to, I don't play golf, but those people who play golf now, they're playing golf 3 or 4 times a week. I'm not sure that's a godly calling. But
I hear you.
Yeah. So you don't want to feel guilty that you're now in a new phase of life and you're enjoying things and spending your life in a different way than you did.
Look, I do think there's going to be some level of guilt in that regardless, especially if you're in a helping profession. Like, yes, I could still be helping people, but I'm choosing not to at this point. But then the question in that sense becomes, okay, I don't want to go through the grind anymore of what I was doing. But how, if I'm missing that helping people, how can I help people in a different way? And I'm not denigrating going out and playing a round of golf. But, are you finding the meaning and the deeper spiritual connection by doing it? Yeah, you're outside, it's nice, you're playing with friends, you're getting some social connection, but are you getting the same kind of vocational, as Rabbi Sacks would call it, vocational connection in that sense. And some people might not, and they might just be perfectly content with the social connection. And as he says, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. You're just not doing it.
I mean, that's always what people, being a retired, as soon as I start talking to somebody who I hadn't seen for a while, they frequently say, so what are you doing with your life? Or don't you miss, taking care of patients or saving lives or whatever you were doing? And sometimes for different people, that's a difficult question to answer.
Yeah. Look, my father was a physician for over 30 years. And when he retired, he was, long story there, but when he retired, he continued to teach for 15 years. Like, he would still go in once a month to teach the students. Why? Because that was his vocation. Like the doctor stuff, he was in nuclear medicine. So reading scans, administering scans, that was his, he was very good at it. He was very skilled at it. It was something he could do that nobody else did. But ultimately, it was the teaching that really he loved. And so he retired. He didn't want to go through the grind of the scans every day, but he said, I'm still going to teach once a month. And he would go in once a month and teach, because that gave him that meaning for a long time.
How about you, Howard? What makes meaning out of your life?
Well, I'll just tell you, I mean, what I did, one thing I did a few things, but I worked with CASA. I don't know if you know CASA, court-appointed special advocates, working with the court systems for disadvantaged kids that are having home problems, essentially, placement issues, and I did that for several years until the politics of it kind of wore me down. And I tried to change it into something they didn't want to change it to. And we parted ways. And I tried to work for the city of Birmingham for a while, not work for them, volunteer in the medical field. And they did not show any interest at all. So, I mean, but anyway, that's sort of a couple things.
You did, yeah.
CASA was a nice experience. I enjoyed that. It was something I knew a little bit about, and I learned about the legal aspect of it. It's fun.
So as we're wrapping up our class for today, there was one line in here which I thought was very timely. I'm going to be reading the book of Esther Saturday night, 7:30 p.m. And on Sunday morning, Minyan beginning at 8 a.m. We'll do the Megillah reading at the point in the service where we do the Megillah reading. But of course, there's one of my favorite motivational speeches from Mordechai in chapter 4, in which he says to Esther, don't think you're going to get out of this on your own. Don't think you're going to get out of this if you say nothing, but perhaps it is just for this, it is for this moment that you arrived at this position. And as Rabbi Sacks says, the fact that I am here in this place at this time with these abilities is not accidental. There's a task to perform, and God is calling us to it. So, wherever we are in our lives, may we, in the coming weeks, find, in this time, in this place, with our personal abilities, find the task that God wants us to perform forever. God.
Thank you for that nice connection.
Amen.
So next week, everybody here next week?
Think so.
It's spring break, so I wasn't sure, like winter break, there were a lot of people gone, so thought I would double check. But we'll meet again next week. Same Beit Midrash time, same Beit Midrash link. And we'll do a Parshat Tzav next week, so it should be good. Thank you all for coming. Kol hakavod to you. Thanks for learning together. And if I don't see you before then, Shabbat Shalom.
Nice to see everyone as usual.
Shabbat Shalom and happy Purim.
Shabbat Shalom. Happy
Hag Purim Sameach.
Chag Sameach.